Good afternoon from the debate class of West Potomac High School. I'm Bradley Vieco of the West Potomac football team, and I welcome you to the first of one 30-minute debate between Claire and Private First Class Hale. This debate is sponsored by Snickers, and tonight we will have the candidates at the podiums. Now, answer to a question can exceed 2 minutes. No opening statement, but each candidate will have time for a 2-minute closing statement. I have told no one from the two campaigns what the questions are. The audience is not here to participate, only to listen. I have asked, as they have agreed to remain silent for the next 30 minutes, except for right now, when they will applaud as we welcome the two candidates, Claire and Private First Class Hale. Okay. So, Nick, you said that you're concerned with America's image abroad, and so do you think that police misconduct is a more important problem to address, or are there more important ones to you?
There definitely are a lot more important issues to me. I think police misconduct is a horrible thing, and there should be investigations into every police action, but police misconduct comes from a much more complex related issue, and I think the biggest issue with police conduct is, so in 2016 the crime rate for murder was 32% whites convicted and 52% blacks convicted. And when you have stats like that, police are going to be, when they're investigating a crime for murder, they're going to be a little bit more, racially prejudiced to a black person, simply because of the statistics and things like that. And also, in 2018, 55 police officers died in the line of duty, and almost all of them died in some kind of, someone was speeding, the car pulled over, they went to write a ticket, and they were shot. That's how 80% of the deaths occurred. And again, the policing is a very hard job. You have to know when to make the call, and a lot of the time, if you make the wrong call, it could be, your image getting ruined, or you dying. And so that's why I think there are definitely a lot better things to focus on. And I think education is one of those, because a lot of minorities and stuff like that, they aren't getting the best education they possibly can. And I think if they were given more choice and they were more, active in their learning, they wouldn't have to end up committing crime.
Okay, thank you. So, Claire, how do you...
No, you have to give her a chance to respond.
Oh,
Do
yeah.
I get this one?
Yeah.
Perfect. Are you timing how long you're talking for?
Yeah, here's your time.
Okay. Well, 2 minutes is his max.
To start off, I think blaming minorities for the fact that they're being killed by police is unfair. And I think I'd like to point out that the NAACP found that blacks are actually put in prison at a rate 6 times higher than whites. It's not necessarily that they're committing more crimes, it's that they're punished more harshly and they suffer the penalties more than white people do. And they suffer more because of the strike system, and they're punished more harshly, 3.73 times more likely to be arrested for marijuana possession. You pointed out that there were police officers who were being killed, but actually police officers are, in the last 10 years, were only feloniously killed in 0.00008% of all interactions. And they interact with thousands of people on a weekly basis. And it's the idea that police are in danger of being killed at every moment, 24/7, is wrong. The first rule of law enforcement for police officers that they're taught is that their overriding goal every day is to go home at the end of their shift, when they should be focusing on protecting the community. That's what their job is. Their job is to protect and serve, not to get home at every night. Of course, we want that. But to focus on that is ridiculous, because it scares officers into having quick trigger fingers, and it scares officers into shooting people and giving in to these false biases that the police department feeds into. And I do think that there are other issues that as a government we need to focus on, but I think minimizing the effects of police brutality and police misconduct is wrong. That's all.
Alright, so Claire, do you believe that we should take away some of the powers of police officers to reduce police misconduct, even if it could affect overall public safety?
I think more than taking away the powers of police officers, it would be changing the way police officers are trained. Where instead of focusing on use of force, I would focus on the de-escalation and more transparency and accountability for officers. Use of force training, they have a use of force continuum, which is officer presence is their first use of force, and then it's verbal, and then it's non-lethal, which is putting your hands on the suspect, and then it's lethal. And those are basically their 4 options. And they're trained that if they ever feel in danger, they can skip the other 3 and go directly into pulling their weapon and using lethal force. And I do think that police officers need to have guns, and they need to be able to defend themselves, they need to be able to defend other people in the community. But I think we need to focus on the fact that instead of going automatically for reaching for your weapon, you need to understand that there are ways to talk to people, and that de-escalation is an important way to help minimize both the casualties that other people cause and the casualties that our officers are causing. And places like Richmond, California have seen a major decrease in officers using force, including lethal force, without increasing the officer fatalities by implementing these de-escalation regulations and putting more oversight on cops.
So she talks a lot about, training and stuff. I don't think that simply training is going to solve the problem entirely. I think the root of the problem is the crimes they are committing. All right? And if you actually, I don't think police are just going around shooting every black person they see, because a lot of these cases can easily be explained why it happened or what actually went down. A lot of these cases are not just them shooting. A lot of them are resisting arrest. In fact, blacks are more likely than a white person to resist arrest. And that's not okay. That is illegal. What should be happening is if you're innocent, act like it. If you're innocent, you don't need to fight back. Why would you need to fight back if you have nothing to hide? And while, yes, there are some cases that can definitely be, the police officer was in the wrong. But you can't let one bad apple ruin the entire batch. That's all I have to say.
Okay. Alright, moving on to the next section.
You want to respond to that?
Yes, I do really quick. I'd like to say that it's not one bad apple. It's systematic racism that's causing our police officers to wrongfully shoot unarmed black men in our community. It's not every police officer shooting black men, but it is enough. It is enough officers making these mistakes because of bias that they are not recognizing. And the idea that if you're innocent, act like it, and that blacks committing these crimes means that they're in some reason responsible for the deaths is disgusting, because you cannot blame someone, you cannot say that someone is innocent and they should act like it when black boys are taught from birth basically that they should fear officers because they have valid reasons to fear these officers. They are dying.
Okay.
Grace, you want to respond to that? No?
Well, that ties back into my education policy. I think that in our education system, we need to take away this idea that police officers are so bad, because that's the thing that causes them to resist arrest, and that's the thing that causes them to get shot. You cannot just blame an officer for shooting someone who tried, taking their gun away, who was heavily resisting arrest and was not acting like an innocent person.
I'm not blaming people who actively attack the police. I'm not blaming them for doing that. I'm blaming them for shooting people like Mike Brown and Eric Garner, who was choked to death. for resisting arrest when they can obviously use tactics that don't include choking a man to death or shooting an unarmed kid. And that's the problem. The root of the problem is not officers saving their own lives when they are attacked. The root of the problem is that officers are using force when no force is necessary, or minimal force is necessary. They are going to the maximum when they do not need to, because they are trained to always expect the maximum level of violence.
Alright. So moving on to the next section, cyber terrorism. This question is for Nick. Nick, what are your thoughts on cyber terrorism, and how do you think it can be solved, and in what way does this affect society?
Cyber terrorism is definitely a growing threat. It has many terrible implications. In fact, there's already been several cyber terrorist attacks by individuals. And I think one of the ways we can combat this is by having more choices and electives in schools that, that deal with cybersecurity systems and deal with anti-cyber terrorism. And it doesn't just need to be specific electives in classes that directly teach you the skills needed for a job of that type, but just having more classes, like instead of having your science class in a classroom environment with your teacher writing on the whiteboard information, we could have one that takes place in a classroom environment and one that takes place more online and technologically, based. And I think that would not only help in fields like cyber terrorism, but other growing technological based jobs.
So I definitely agree that expanding our education system and putting more effort into education and a more holistic style of education would be good for our country and to help people learn more about what they want to learn. But I do think that getting rid of curriculums completely would make it more difficult for teachers to do their job, would make it more difficult to allocate money to schools specifically. As to specifically cyber terrorism, I think we need to be focusing on hack prevention, not managing the after effects of hacks, which is what we're doing largely. More funding to the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, who focus specifically on cyber threats and terror. And when companies and airlines are hacked and the like, I believe that they should assume a portion of the financial burden that people suffer when they lose this money, because they need to be taking responsibility for the information that they lost.
Okay. Alright. So, this question is for Claire, and do you think that we should invest more in improving cybersecurity, or do you think that it will be a waste of money and increase national debt?
I think we should, since we're a very technologically based society, and I think investing in this relatively new style of terrorism, this style of attacks, and especially since we've seen how we've had issues with the Russians trying to hack the election and trying to influence our elections, I think that cyber terrorism is a very real threat, and it should be treated as such, and we should put money into sciences, and we should put money into protection and stay up to date with the latest technology.
Nick, would you say that?
No.
So moving on to the next section, taxing of the wealthy. This question is for Nick, and so hold on, let me try to find it. Okay. So Nick, with all the U.S. government budget deficit nearing $1 trillion for the fourth straight year, do you think that the best move for economic recovery is to raise taxes for those making a certain high amount of money to reduce the national deficit?
No. I think that simply taxing alone is not going to solve the tax problem, and I don't think that, I think they're already getting taxed the right amount. I think there definitely are loopholes that they do use, and I do think that those need to be investigated further. But no, I do not believe that that just taxing, a specific minority of people with a certain amount of money will do little to, if not anything, to help fix the deficit. I think what would is by focusing on educating people to have newer, more high money making jobs, and implementing we're going to teach people skills that they need for high paying jobs. We're going to teach it better than we are right now, and we're going to improve the economy this way.
Anything to say to that?
Yes. I think without having more money coming into the economy, we don't have the resources to pay for all these new education plans. I agree that we should put more money into education at all levels, from preschool all the way to college. But I think that we need to be more realistic on how we're going to get that money. Yes, we can take money out of the budget that we already have, but I think there is untapped potential in the upper class who is not, and absolutely is not paying what they owe this country. Okay? Warren Buffett pays the same amount of taxes that someone in the middle class pays, because we don't tax investment income the same way we tax wage income, which makes no sense. People make millions of dollars off of investments, and we don't tax it the way we tax income because we see it as soft income. And I think that we should add more tax brackets at the upper level so we can ensure people are paying more as their income increases, and tax investments should be taxed in the same way, and we should cap tax deductions at 28% for the rich, because I think that this will cause more money to move into the economy, and in that way we'll be able to fund all these things that we want to do.
So, alright, so could you please clarify on what would be the proper, how much money would someone need, or how much money would they need to make from investments and things like that to file under your new tax?
So, the amount that I have here is $250,000 or more a year.
Okay. So, I think that, well, yes, there are a lot of these investment loopholes and stuff used by, rich individuals to earn more money than they share, and I think that needs to be shut down. However, I do not think that by just increasing taxes and stuff, that's going to provide any benefits. I think what would be better is instead having tax cuts for companies and people who have less carbon emissions and a lot less, things that hurt the environment. They use less plastic, use a lot less of things that harm the environment. And I think by encouraging them to do that, it would help CO2 levels in the US.
I concur with that 100%, but I don't think one means that we can't do the other. I think we should give tax cuts for people who are using solar panels at home, for companies who are using environmentally friendly things, and I totally agree with that, because I think that the environment is a huge problem that we need to focus on now. But I don't think that because we're giving those tax cuts, that means we cannot tax the wealthy to make sure that they are paying the same amount proportionally to what the middle and lower class are paying.
This question is for Claire. So you mentioned about making a better opportunity for immigrants to come into the U.S. So how are you going to be able to give the immigrants? How are you going to be able to tax the immigrants when they are unemployed here? How are they going to be able to pay those taxes?
Unemployed, the majority of immigrants here are not unemployed. The majority of immigrants, 76% of immigrants, first off, are in the country legally, and they are paying taxes because they are employed, and they come here for better opportunities. And even undocumented immigrants, they're trying their damnedest to get their citizenship, but they can't because of these 3-year and 10-year caps that we have, that if they want to become citizens, they have to leave the country for at least 3 years and up to 10 years to even be allowed to become citizens. And I think that the overgeneralization that immigrants are unemployed and are living off of the United States security programs without actually giving anything to the economy is completely baseless, because the vast majority of immigrants coming in, actually the largest group is from Asia, and they're coming in to do these tech works. They're coming into California to do all these jobs, and they are paying their taxes the same way that any other citizen would.
Okay, I agree that the legal immigration system is heavily flawed. It is incredibly, incredibly long and tedious, and some parts of the immigration policy we already have are just useless, like the citizenship test it needs to be heavily reformed. It includes way too much things that are very opinionated based. I think all that really needs to be on a citizenship test for legal immigrants is our laws and how to follow them. However, I do think that we cannot have this overly easy to get in. I think it still needs to be semi-difficult. I think it needs to be easier, but I think that by just completely reforming everything, that's going to cost a lot of money. That's going to be a very hard and slow process to implement, especially how would you counteract the opposition that the Border Patrol would most likely put up. And I don't agree that we need to have all of these immigrants come in for job reasons. I think that we're already starting to have a housing and job problem, or more housing. I think that we need to focus a lot more on just legal immigration, not illegal immigration.
Thank you, Nick.
Okay, if I can respond to that really quickly. I think first off that we should limit Customs and Border Patrol's ability, especially their ability to do rampart citizenship test 100 miles within any border, no matter what, even the oceans. And I think that you're vastly overestimating the amount of immigrants we have coming into this country without documentation. They account for less than 4% of the US population. And we are at historic lows of immigrants coming in from Central America into the United States. This idea that it's some national emergency or some crazy thing is ridiculous. And the very fact that immigrants actually the Marshall Project found that undocumented immigration has no tie to crime levels, so it's not that they're a drain on this community. They're actually helping the community. Whether or not they're documented, these people are coming because they need help or they want more opportunities. And I think that instead of just focusing on necessarily making it super easy, because I don't want every immigrant who wants to come into the United States to come in, I've never said that. I think we need to not only focus on making the citizenship exam easier and making citizenship easier and asylum easier, and that people should be able to apply for asylum outside of these ports, we also need to invest in countries where we have the most immigrants coming from and help their economies, which both strengthens our bonds with those countries and helps our own economy.
Okay, can I respond to that? Do you know how much illegal immigration costs the U.S.?
I'm sure you do, so.
$1.15 billion. That is how much it costs when an illegal immigrant comes in here and we have to provide documentation and things like that. Also, I do not agree with you that we should limit the Border Patrol's reach. I think the Border Patrol, if you try and come into this country, I don't think you can just, as soon as you come in, just go anywhere you want and, worry about citizenship tests and stuff like that later. I think it does need to take place at the border.
I think it should take place at the border, but I think the fact that Customs and Border Patrol can stop anybody within 100 miles of any border, Canada, within the borders of the Atlantic and Pacific Ocean, and ask for documentation, that's a problem. It promotes fear, and it's an issue, and they have too much power in that sense. And I think part of that $1.15 billion is this overfunding that we've given to ICE and Border Protection, because one of my key points is that we should split up ICE. I don't believe that ICE should stop dealing with immigration. I do believe that we should have immigration enforcement, but I don't think immigration should be a criminal offense. It is a civil offense. Undocumented immigration is a civil offense, and I believe ICE should be split up, wherein the primary part will be pursuing criminals and terrorists involved in drug trafficking, weapons smuggling, and human trafficking, cybercrime, which is what they're meant to do. And then there will be a separate agency focused on immigration enforcement that is not tied to criminal enforcement, because that promotes fear within the country, that promotes fear within people living in the country, both who are citizens and who are not. And I believe that we could focus funding on there, and then we will not be overfunding in the way, and it will increase oversight as well.
Alright, so Nick, you mentioned that you wanted to like make things more solar powered. So how is your tax plan going to ensure that like energy and innovation in the country?
Yes, I don't want to increase taxes for these projects. I think we already have the budget needed to innovate with this stuff. I definitely think the military has been wasting their time on things like jet fighters that are way too experimental and highly volatile. And I think most of that military funding for new military projects should be devoted to newer forms of nuclear powered energy. And what I don't want is I don't want a repeat of the massive solar and wind building that we did, because one nuclear reactor in the US equals 2 coal power plants or 4 solar and wind power plants. And it also has the highest maximum carrying capacity of any of the forms of energy that the US uses, being at 94.6%, which means 96.4% at that time. It creates the maximum amount of energy it can produce, while solar and wind has the worst. But what I do think that solar and wind power should be used for is on a lot smaller scale for things like lights, and I think companies should also have tax cuts and things like that, you know, if they create, let's say, solar powered toasters or electric cars. I think there should be tax cuts and incentives for them to do that renewable source of energy. And also coal. A lot of environmentalists believe that coal needs to be completely gotten rid of. And while I would like to see less uses of coal energy, there are clean forms of coal.
Alright,
Right. To begin with, this idea that you're touting that wind energy is not viable is wrong. Wind energy is and has been the most promising form of clean energy. It is. And the wind sector employs 100,000 plus workers in 2016 alone. It's one of the fastest growing, wind turbine technicians, one of the fastest growing American jobs in the whole decade. And wind could support more than 600,000 jobs in manufacturing, installation, maintenance, and support service by 2050. Turbines can not only be built in these gigantic wind farms, but they can be built on farms and existing ranches. It's a domestic source of energy. It enables U.S. industry growth and competitiveness, and has an annual economic impact of $20 billion in the U.S. economy. The idea that nuclear energy is the end-all, be-all is just wrong in a base way, because wind energy is cleaner, and though it may not be completely as efficient, it's safer. And I think that we need to be focusing on that, and I also think we need to be phasing out coal faster than what my opponent thinks, because I think coal, even cleaner coal, it's not viable, and it's still hurting the environment. This idea that we can remove all carbon emissions from coal and use it anyways it's just not realistic in the next few years. And we already see that a record number of coal plants in 2018 have already retired, and I think that this just needs to be taken into account, and I think that you're using information that is just not accurate.
Okay. So the carrying capacity for wind is 32.4%. That means 32.4% of the time it creates the maximum amount of energy it can. And speaking of which, when I talked about the new innovations for nuclear energy, currently right now, small companies, or mid to small size companies that research nuclear energy are working on nuclear fusion, which, if created, it could completely reduce all emissions from nuclear energy. And also, there's also a new form of nuclear energy being produced that would use the waste from reactors, creating a almost renewable source of nuclear energy. Wind does also, a lot of wind power right now, it can only be built in certain areas, especially on hills and stuff. That's where most of them are built, because that's where most of the wind is. but you also have to take effect that birds and flight paths occur in those areas, and there have been cases where giant flocks of birds have been just shredded by wind plants. And so I don't think that in the long term wind would be all that useful.
Okay, so I think focusing on nuclear fusion instead of investing in already existing clean energy sources that have proven to work is not the best use of our resources. I do believe that nuclear fusion, if it worked, would be amazing. It would be a relatively clean energy source and it would power us forever, basically, is like what they're touting. And I think that we should invest in trying to do this, but we should leave that to private companies. And we can give subsidies to private companies doing this type of thing, but we need to focus on existing energy sources. And yes, nuclear fission works, but if it produces 94%, which I think is the number you gave, and then 31%, but how many nuclear power plants do we have versus how many wind farms can we build? And I think the economic impact that building these nuclear power plants has initially is worse than those of building the turbines. And yes, my heart bleeds for the birds. But in the same way that birds die for turbines, birds also die in airplanes, and we're not shutting down airplanes because birds die. And I understand the point. I do understand that people think that they're ugly, and people think that the noise is annoying. But we need to focus on the fact that we are headed straight first into a climate catastrophe. And we cannot be nice to these oil companies, and we cannot give subsidies to these coal companies because they are lobbying for us. We need to understand that if we do not make a change immediately, we are going to die. We are going to cause irreversible damage to the planet, and it's not going to be livable anymore.
Anything to say to that?
This idea that climate change is going to absolutely destroy humanity has been disproven time and time again. Okay? We are not going to die in 12 years. In fact, I think AOC, the one who popularized this, recently came out and said it was all a joke in a tweet. So I do not believe in this, we are all going to die if we don't fix climate change right now.
I am going to interrupt you here because we've already gone over the time, and I never said we're going to die in 12 years. In 12 years, we're passing a point of irreversible damage that we've done to the environment. If we do not make a change, it will not be 12 years from now, but we will come to a point where we cause irreversible damage to the planet, and we will die. Maybe not this generation, maybe not the next generation, but we are the generation right here, right now, who has to make the change, or else we will not be able to go back.
All right.
Can I cut it off? Or town hall?
Does anyone have any pressing questions they really want to ask?
No, I didn't like the end, but.
Okay. All right, go cut it.